Thank you guys again for having me out. I'm really excited to be here. And before I dive into my presentation, raise your hand if you're in college right now. Okay. So we've got some college kids here. I went to Michigan State University, and go white. And I took I think like everyone pretty much takes like Psych 101 in college, Psychology 101 in college. And I remember being in this class, and I only remember one thing from this class to this date. And I was sitting in this class. It's one of those classes that's like 500 people because everyone's in it. And our professor was telling this story about this woman. And this story shocked me. And it continues to motivate so much of what I do. And I want to share it because I think it applies really well to why we're all here in this room right now on a beautiful day, on a Thursday, when we could be doing so many other things. All right, so this story. The story starts in New York City in the late 60s or early 70s. I can't quite remember the date now, but several decades ago. And it's about 2 a.m. in the morning, and this woman is getting off work. She's a bartender in Brooklyn. She gets out of work at 2 a.m. She gets on a public transport, and she's going home to her apartment. She gets off the bus, and it's almost 3 a.m. at this point, and she's walking towards her apartment. She can see the building down the road. Who here has been to New York City before? Okay, so a lot of you know, and if you don't know, I'm sure you can imagine, New York City is a very big city. There's lots of people all crammed on top of each other. This is also a fairly long time ago. There wasn't a ton of air conditioning. It was in the summer. All the windows were open. She's walking home. It's about 3 a.m. at this point, and a man comes up behind her and brutally assaults her. He stabs her repeatedly. And while it's happening, she's screaming. She's yelling for help. Help, help, he's stabbing me, he's killing me, I'm going to die, help, help. 200 to 300 people were within earshot of this incident happening. Of those 200 to 300, not one person intervened. Not one person called the police. One guy yelled out the window, "Let that girl alone," and shut the window. Kitty, eventually the person that attacked this woman named Kitty, survived the attack, and she needed to make it to a phone or someone to get help. So she started crawling her way towards her apartment building. She made it into like the landing or the foyer area, but she was going in and out of consciousness. She couldn't make it up the stairs to a phone. About an hour passes, and the man returns to check and see what happened to the victim. He finds her alive, and he attacks her again and leaves. Shortly after that, her friend, her roommate, comes down and finds Kitty at the bottom of the stairs, bleeding out, unconscious, calls an ambulance, and she dies on the way to the hospital. And this story, within a couple days, made it all over the news. Because no one could understand, no one could believe that so many hundreds of people would have witnessed and heard and heard the cries for help from this woman and done nothing to help, done nothing to intervene. Her life could have been saved if even one person would have done something to help. It prompted a lot of studies and things like that, and it helped develop this idea that's now been reproduced over and over again in psychology. It's called the bystander effect. And the bystander effect, simply put, is it goes like this. The more people that witness an injustice or witness a tragedy or witness a crime, the less likely it is that anyone will do anything about it. The more people that witness evil, the less likely it is someone will do something about it. And it sounds so counterintuitive, but you can kind of understand why that might be. Like if you've ever been like in a big group of people and you've seen something bad happening, like not to that degree necessarily, but something bad, you all kind of look around and you're like, who's going to do something? Like everyone's like, someone else must do something. Like it doesn't have to be me. One of these guys will do it, right? Someone will intervene. And we let that collective kind of deference let evil persist. So this has been happening over and over again, and it really applies to what I do now and what Protect Life Michigan does, because we look at those an example of the bystander effect like that, and we see that happening right now on this issue of abortion, and we see that happening even within people, the community of people that would call themselves pro-life. You see, there's really three reactions that can happen when something like an injustice that happened to Kitty Genovese happens. One, you can do nothing, like all the people that heard her screaming and crying for help. Literally ignore the injustice that's happening down the street and continue on with your life as if it doesn't exist. Or you can do like the minimal possible thing imaginable and check off a box and say you did something. Think of the guy who yelled out the window to leave her alone and close the window. He did more than everyone else in that neighborhood, but it was so little compared to the call that should have been, or compared to the call to action that should have happened, right? So little. But he could go to bed and say, hey, I did something. I yelled at the guy to stop. The third response that you can have to an injustice is to intervene on behalf of the victim, is to come to the aid of the defenseless, of the victim, to stop an injustice whenever possible. No one did that for Kitty, but you all have an opportunity to do that now for the victims of abortion. And, you know, I think a lot of times people that are pro-life can point to something that they do and say, like, I did my thing, right? To validate my belief that abortion is wrong. I did this thing. And you might be like, I went to this thing right now where you're sitting in this room, and be like, there's my thing that I did. I'm more pro-life than my friends, so that counts, right? Or maybe you did, some of you, I don't know, you went to a dinner, you made a donation, you volunteered one time, you went on the March for Life trip, you did something. I'd like to challenge you and question, and this is a question for you to answer more than anything, but ask yourself the question, is that really the action that needs to happen when it's compared to the injustice that's occurring? Or is it more similar to yelling out the window and closing the window in the face of evil? In the pro-life community, sometimes we do this, and it kind of became evident to me several months ago. Myself and a few people from PLM, Protect Life Michigan, went to Washington, D.C. To go outside the Supreme Court on the day that they were arguing the case, Dobbs v. Jackson, that might overturn Roe v. Wade this year. So we went there. There's tons of pro-life people from all over the country were there, and it was essentially just as a protest on the day that the oral arguments were happening inside the court. So we were outside. And obviously pro-choice people were going to be there as well to kind of counter-protest or make their voice heard as well. So the police had these fences up to try to divide the sides. So if you're pro-life, go over here on this side, have your pro-life rally. If you're pro-choice, go over here on this side, have your pro-choice rally. Don't mix together because they don't want anything out of control or whatever. Pro-lifers got there at like 9 a.m. We were there and we had like a rally, and there's music and speakers, and everyone's like, yeah, like, you know, this could be it. This could be the case that overturns Roe. We could see so much. We've been working for so many years or decades sometimes for this moment. There's excitement, there's energy, all of it, right? The pro-choice people weren't really there. There's a few people. There weren't really any pro-choice people there yet. And then we found out, we're like, oh, well, the pro-choice rally, they're starting after us, essentially. Like, they want to have their own thing and not intermix with us. And we saw the pro-choice groups coming. And what the pro-choice groups were doing were making a kind of a religious celebration of Roe v. Wade. So they were saying the Lord's Prayer, but to the Lord of abortion, to the God of abortion. They're thanking Jesus for abortion. They're on their knees praying to God for abortion and celebrating and dancing and doing all these things for the right to kill other human beings. And when we saw them coming and doing that, there's probably, at this point, some of the pro-life people left, but at this point there's several hundred still remaining there. And when we saw people coming to celebrate the injustice of abortion, to celebrate the dismemberment of children, to celebrate the killing of innocents, the pro-lifers all left. We had our moment. We decided that we could all gather together as other pro-lifers and congratulate each other for being pro-life, and we could just head on out and let them have their moment to celebrate abortion. And that made me really uncomfortable, because we're standing by, and I realize they're not performing abortions necessarily right then, but they're celebrating what is evil. And we are more comfortable letting them have their moment to do that. Myself and the other people from PLM, there's about 5 of us at this point, stayed back. And then there's about 4 or 5 other people that were from San Francisco, and they're not religious at all, but they're anti-abortion, they're progressive anti-abortion people, and it was just us, like 10 people, and we're like, I don't think we should let them have their rally. Like, I don't think we should not do anything while they do this. So we had buckets, like Home Depot buckets, like those 5-gallon ones, and we had sticks. And we had a couple bullhorns and things like that. And we just kind of casually worked our way up to the front of the pro-choice rally. And we were in between the speaker and the audience. There's only 100 people or so, pro-choice people, that were doing this. And we're in between those two. And we decided we're just not going to let them have the rally. So we made as much noise as we possibly could with these buckets and sticks as 10 people, yelling and screaming, using bullhorns. And they eventually stopped speaking and left to go back to their headquarters in the building. And we were able, did anything of that really come necessarily? No one's heart was changed, no one's mind was changed. They didn't leave and be like, oh my gosh, we are so pro-life now because we heard these guys were banging on drums in front of us. But what we did do is say that it's not okay to have a party for abortion. If you're going to have a party for abortion, there's going to be people there that are going to speak up for the victims that can't speak up for themselves. And that's what we need to do sometimes. And the way that I think about what my response needs to be when I hear about the injustice of abortion is I remember the story of Kelly Genovese, and I remember those things that happened, and I remember so many other injustices where I'm like, I know I would do something. I know if I was in Brooklyn at 3 a.m. on that night, I would have done something to intervene, but the reality is I have to continually remind myself that I almost certainly wouldn't. 300 out of 300 people did not do anything. Why do I think I'm so different? Why do I think I'm so much better? So I have to make a conscious decision every single day to go out and do something that's really difficult. And luckily, there's a lot of people now that are doing that are young and engaged and doing really difficult things on college and in high schools that we're working with, and we're equipping them to do those things. We're working with really great organizations to do so, and I really want to see this group of people doing that too. And when I say this group of people, I'm not talking to this group of people, I'm talking to you right now individually sitting in this chair, because you can't look around and say, yeah, this group of people will do something, because it's the bystander effect. They won't do anything unless you decide for yourself you will do something. So the way that we do this is we go out and we talk with everybody. We talk with anyone we can possibly talk to about abortion. We're an outreach activist organization, and we're equipping students to become outreach-oriented activists for the unborn. Ultimately, it's centered around dialogue. We don't want to be crazy people, and we don't want to be rude or mean or anything like that. So we want to be good at persuading people to be against the injustice of abortion. The only way that we're going to see abortion eliminated from this nation or from this world is if we start convincing people that think it's okay right now that it's not okay. Which means you have to go out and talk to people that don't like you, that probably hate you for what you think, and actually engage with them in dialogue about this issue. It's the only way people's minds are going to change, if they hear someone tell them the truth, if they hear someone tell them the reality of what's happening. So we make a big focus on equipping our students to go out and do this, and do it persuasively, with love, with truth, to make abortion unthinkable in this state, for our focus at least. So why does this issue matter. If you guys are in high school, as you go into college, you're going to be exposed to a lot of wrongs that are in this world. Like, this world is very fallen. This world is very broken. Abortion is not the only injustice that exists in this nation, in this world. However, you're going to be, having to make some decisions potentially on where to, invest your time, your energy, your passion, your dedication, your comfort, your reputation. What things are you going to focus on making the world a better place in? And I want to make a plea that abortion not necessarily should be everyone's number one issue all the time, but I want to make a plea that it should be, for a lot of you, a number one issue. Because I don't think that right now there's a greater injustice happening in this nation than the injustice of abortion. And the reason, it's hard to compare injustices to get that, but the reason that I do that is because I kind of think about injustices in a few ways. One, I think about who the victim of an injustice is. When we hear about something terrible happening, sometimes we have a different reaction based on who the victim of it was. If we hear about a terrible car accident, sometimes we have a different reaction if there was like a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old in the car, or there was just like a 45-year-old man in the car. Like, both cases are terrible. A life was lost. It's a tragedy. But sometimes we think of things differently based on the victim. And so who is the victim of abortion? The victim of abortion is someone that is, if innocence exists at all in the world, it is absolutely with the unborn. Someone who's incapable of any thought of any wrong, of any evil. Someone who has no ability to defend themselves or cry out in pain or march in the streets or vote or donate the money to see change that they want to see occur. Someone who has no ability to cry out in pain when their bodies are shredded apart. The victim of abortion is the most innocent and defenseless of all victims. Next, we consider the scale of abortion. What is the scale of this injustice? What does it actually look like? And when we think about the scale of abortion, it's an injustice that has never been experienced before on such a sustained level for so long, to take the life of so many people for such a long period of time. We're talking about nearly 1 million lives being taken every single year in the United States since Roe v. Wade in 1973. 60 million lives being lost just in the United States. We're talking about 2,363 lives every day being lost to abortion in the United States. It's a loss of life that we've never experienced before in human history on such a sustained scale. Next, we think about the consequence of the injustice. What is lost? There's lots of injustices. Some of them are more meaningful, have a greater consequence than others. Your reputation might be affected by an injustice. Your financial situation might be affected. Your friendships might be affected. Your freedom might be affected. But the consequence of abortion is always a life being lost, a life being taken. The most wrong thing that one person can do to another person is to permanently end their existence, is to take away everything from them by taking their life. There is no greater consequence to an injustice than the loss of life. And lastly, the suffering. What is the suffering of abortion? And I promise you, the suffering of abortion is real, is significant. For the child, it is an act of violence committed against them to intentionally end their life. For the people around that situation, the suffering is real. For the mother, the suffering is real. For the family, the suffering is real. Whenever there is violence, there is always suffering. So when we think about abortion and why this matters, why this should be an issue you should care about, and why this should be an issue you lose something for, those are the reasons why. Because it's a defenseless, innocent victim whose life is being permanently ended at a scale never before seen in human history for such a sustained period of time, who is experiencing tremendous suffering through a violent act. So, what ultimately is our goal? Our goal is threefold. We want to see abortion made unlawful. You know, if you've ever taken like a government class or something like that, people talk about, you know, what's the role of government? And that can get like really complicated or up for debate and kind of whatever. But there is something of a role of government that almost everyone throughout all time have always agreed on. The primary role of government is to make sure that life is not lost, that people do not kill each other, right? So if abortion is what I claim it to be, the intentional killing of an innocent human being, then absolutely our laws and our legal system should reflect that by making it unlawful. However, we recognize that things that are unlawful does not mean that they always cease to occur, right? There are unlawful injustices that still happen every single day in our communities. So we can't stop at making something unlawful, making something illegal. We also need to make it unthinkable, meaning we need to shift the culture. We need to change the way that people think about the unborn and think about crisis pregnancies and think about these situations so that we stop making it seem like the unborn are lesser humans, are not a full equal member of the human family, that women have to choose between continuing their education or ending their pregnancy. We have to disrupt this way that culture frames pregnancy. And then lastly, we have to make abortion unnecessary, meaning there are very, very few instances where someone who's going to go and get an abortion is doing so because they're thrilled to go and get an abortion. That's their number one option. They love it. They want to do it over and over again. Most of the time what's happening is in those situations there's a crisis happening. And it might be a crisis of finances, or it might be a crisis of a relationship, it might be a crisis of abuse. Whatever the situation, the context, the circumstance that is there, we have to identify the cause and remove it whenever we possibly can. Whether that means removing an abusive boyfriend, husband, person, family member, whether it means changing the way that churches and families treat pregnancy, whether it means changing the way that schools treat pregnant students, whether that means changing the way that we financially support women that find themselves in crisis pregnancies or crisis situations. We need to do all of those things so that abortion is no longer a situation where someone says, I have no other choice but to get an abortion. So, at Protect Life Michigan, the way that we engage with this issue is we're extremely activist focused, meaning that most of our day, most of our week, we have several outreaches going on every day throughout the state of Michigan. Those outreaches are really uncomfortable and really difficult. We're going out on the street and we're walking up to strangers and we're saying, hey, what do you think about abortion? And a lot of times we'll have images of the victims of abortion with us, or we'll have videos playing, or we'll have handouts with it, and we'll be talking to people about what they think about this issue. And 10% of the time we yelled at and called really terrible things and spit on and whatever. And then 40-50% of the time people just ignore us and walk away. But the other half of the time people stop and talk to us. And we've had over the past year, we've had about 6,000 conversations just this past school year with individuals about this issue. We've seen several hundred people change their minds on the issue of abortion through the way that we talk about it. And over the past several years, we've evolved in the way that we frame and discuss this issue. You see, we might be pro-life for a wide variety of reasons, I guess, right? And it might change over time. For some people, they're pro-life from a strictly philosophical, scientific perspective, and that's the only thing that really matters to them. Other people are pro-life because they've always been pro-life, their parents have always been pro-life, their churches have always been pro-life, and it's just part of their identity or part of their faith. Whatever it is, what we found is that most of the time when we're talking to a pro-choice person, they don't share the same background that we do on the street. So if we approach it with, hey, I'm pro-life because my church has been pro-life, what do you think about that? They're like, I don't have a church. I have no faith at all. I have a totally different faith. I don't agree with your position because I don't share that worldview or something. So what we've switched to doing and really try to train our students to do is say, hey, is there any way that we can grab their worldview, in general, everyone's worldview, grab that and have them come to their own conclusion that abortion is wrong without us having to, necessarily walk through every part of our own worldview? Like, do they already have enough of an idea about human equality and human rights? They don't need to know anything else. They just have the wrong conclusion from that worldview. So essentially how that works is our position on abortion is one that is motivated from a position on human rights, human equality, and nonviolence. And when you hear those things, if you go to anyone on a college campus and say, hey, do you believe in human rights, human equality, and nonviolence? Every single person's going to be like, yeah, I absolutely do. And we're like, great, we absolutely do too. And now we can talk about abortion. So we come from a position where all humans are fundamentally the same. Meaning we are all equal in our value as equal members of the human population, right? Regardless of how smart you are, how fast you are, how capable you are, how old you are, or how much money you make, it doesn't matter. You are equal in your value at a fundamental level to the rest of the human population. With that equality comes certain rights that we all share. Certain fundamental rights. And whenever possible, our predisposition should be against violence towards other human beings. So we're not anti-violence in every single case all the time necessarily. We do believe that people have a right to defend themselves even if it uses violence. We do believe that there is such thing as a just war. Though most war might not fall in that category, there is a possibility that there's such thing as a just war. So we come from a position when, whenever possible, avoid violence against any human being because they are fundamentally equal to every other human being in value and in rights. Now, if any of you have taken a history class or been alive for several years, you know that humans have this great skill. We have this remarkable ability to say, yeah, I believe in human rights and human equality, and then at the same time find some way to identify a segment of the human population and other them, and segregate them away from the rest of the human population. We've always generally agreed that human beings have value and human beings should not be murdered. But throughout history, we've always been able to find a way to dehumanize one group of human being to advantage another group, or to dehumanize a weaker group of human being to advantage a stronger group of human being. And in the past, we've based it on things like race or gender or economics or ethnicity or family or whatever it might, or intelligence, whatever it might be. We've always had some way that we've used or that we've justified treating people in an unjust manner. And every time we try to other or segregate out a group of people based on some characteristic that they cannot control, it always leads to an injustice. Every time. And every time it leads to an injustice, eventually we will recover from it. And we will always look back and say, I can't believe that we did that. How unusual that we would treat a certain group of human being as lesser, as different than us, so that we could abuse some of their rights, potentially to our advantage. And we act shocked and appalled and say, we'll never do it again. But what we're doing now is just a repeat of history like we've done so many times before. Instead of basing it on someone's gender, religion, or whatever, we're basing it on someone's age, or whether or not they have a certain level of function or ability. We're saying because this group of human is younger or can't perform some function yet, because they have some greater degree of dependency to sustain their own life, we can treat them in a way we would not normally be able to treat another human being. So the human rights argument we found to be the most effective. The way that we typically start a human rights argument with someone, if someone walks up to me on the street, I walk up to them and I'll say, hey, what do you think about abortion? And they'll be shocked for a second because no one ever talks about abortion with them on the street, and that makes sense. I don't know what I would say if someone just randomly did that to me. But eventually they'll come out with something, and they'll say, I don't know, I don't like it, but I think it should be someone's choice. Or I don't know, up to a certain point, maybe, like not third trimester, but before that, I think it's okay. Or they'll be like, I'm okay with it in every situation. They'll provide some justification for their position, or some limit that they'll have on their position, I guess. And we kind of have two ways that we'll start a dialogue with them that focuses in really well on a human rights argument. The first way is we'll essentially say, all right, I hear what you're saying. Can I ask you like a couple weird questions? Just kind of brace them for that, because it is unusual to ask these questions. We'll say, all right, look around at everyone walking around on the street right now. Look around at all these people on campus right now. Is there anyone that is the same as another person? Is there anyone that is identical in every way to another person that you can see walking around right now? And they'll say, no one's the same. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. We're all different, heights and weights and intelligence levels and majors and whatever. But no one's the same. We all have different families and all kinds of stuff, right? We're all very different. But then we'll ask, do you think that we're all equal? Do you think that we're all that we all have the same rights? And they'll say, well, yeah, obviously, of course. Then we kind of move the discussion and say, okay, well, why? Why are we all equal? What justification do you have for this belief in human equality? Why do you think we're the same if we aren't actually the same? Why do you think we have the same rights if none of us are identical? And most of the time they're like, they don't really know. Like, it's a weird question, I get it. So we kind of help them out. We're like, all right, I believe in human equality as well, and I believe in human rights for all humans. The foundation for that has to be something. We can't just decide that that's the case, because then someone else could decide that's not the case and abuse people. So what is the justification for it? If we're all equal, we must have something in common equally at all times. There must be something that we have, some characteristic that we have, all in common in all ways equally forever. What is the only thing that we have in common in all ways with every person? The only thing that we have is the mere fact that we are human. Human. Exactly. We are human beings. Amen. The only thing we have in common is being human. So if you truly believe in human equality for all humans, the only grounding for that is being human. If you are human, you are one of us. You are like us. You deserve the protections that come with being like us. And if I were to ask you, what is an unborn child? What is a fetus? Is it ever a cat, a dog, a fish, a tree? Or is it always going to be a human? Is it always biologically a human? If so, then its humanity immediately qualifies it as being one of us. If we believe in human equality, its humanity makes it equal to us. So if it is wrong to take the life of anyone in this room, if it's wrong to take the life of anyone who is 2 or 3 years old, if it's wrong to take the life of anyone who's 80 or 90 years old, if it's wrong to end their life, it's because they're human. And because the unborn is human, it's wrong to end their life as well. So the way that people will try to get around that is they'll try to get to some point where they'll say something like, I hear what you're saying. They're kind of backed in a corner now, so like, why do I think they're different? And in some ways that's like an honest thing, because there is something different. Like, they aren't like the same as us in like an obvious way sometimes. Like, they don't look like a cute little baby all the time, right? If you ever seen like an ultrasound, they look like little squirrels. Like, they don't seem like they belong necessarily in some way. So they're trying to reconcile that and be like, okay, I'm not ready to say abortion's wrong. What is the difference then? Why do I think it's okay to allow abortion? And they'll come up with all sorts of things. They'll say like it's a clump of cells. It doesn't have a heartbeat yet. It doesn't have brainwaves yet. It can't survive outside of the womb. It's dependent on the life of the mother for its own survival. It's the first or second or third trimester. Whatever they'll say, they'll come up with some difference between the humans that we all are right now that are equal and protected and the humans that we once were in the womb that should not be equal and protected. And all of those differences are going to fall into one of four categories, and they conveniently spell an acronym SLED. Size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. So they're going to say it's a clump of cells, it's smaller, it's size. It doesn't have a heartbeat yet or brainwaves yet. It hasn't reached a developmental milestone yet. It's located in the womb versus outside of the womb. It's an environment thing, or it's dependent on the life of the mother. If you just think about those four differences, all you have to kind of ask yourself is, are any of those four differences morally significant to the point that I should be able to kill someone based on those differences? Meaning, should size ever determine whether or not I can take your life? No. I'm not a super big guy. There's lots of people in this room that are bigger and stronger and taller than me. I am anti-size value, right? Don't kill me because I'm smaller. Level of development. Are we, at different points in our life, achieving different developmental milestones? Meaning from the point you are a newborn to the point that you are a 5-year-old, to the point that you're a 15-year-old, to the point that you're a 25-year-old, are you achieving developmental milestones physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever? Absolutely. Should any of those developmental milestones ever impact your right to not be killed? No. Because your level of development doesn't impact your human rights. So maybe it's environment, your location. None of you are currently located inside a womb after all, right? That's a pretty big difference. But does it impact your human rights? Meaning, as I move, as I travel across this room, should my rights as a human change? I can't be killed here, but when I walk out that door, I can be killed. That doesn't make sense. My human rights should go wherever I go. If I'm a human, my rights stay with me as a human. So environment and location cannot be the justification of abortion. So maybe it's degree of dependence, probably the most common explanation people will offer. It's dependent on the life of the mother to survive. It cannot survive on its own. It is not viable. Therefore, abortion is okay. However, again, ask yourself, does degree of dependency matter in that way? Should degree of dependency determine your human rights, your human value? My brother and sister-in-law both have type 1 diabetes. They have an insulin pump. They've had it their whole life. And they, if they go without that, they'll die, or without some other form of medical intervention, they'll die within a day or so. Their body is entirely dependent on medical technology and other people to survive. But their rights as a human, their value as a human is not impacted in any way by that dependency. A newborn is entirely dependent on someone else to sustain its life. It becomes less dependent as it grows, as it ages, and then a lot of times it becomes more dependent again as it ages. Someone's human value is not a roller coaster. Someone's human rights is not a roller coaster where you acquire more and then you lose them again based on your dependency to survive. So these four categories of differences between the human that you are right now seeing in this room and the fetus that you once were all fall into these categories that are all morally insignificant. They should not determine in any way the value that you have as an equal human being to every other person in this room. Now, I told you a little bit about what we do. Like I said, we're a very activist organization. There's a lot of organizations that you can get involved with. They're not, what we do sometimes is controversial, I guess, because we'll go out and we'll talk to people about abortion. We'll use abortion victim photography. We'll use videos of abortion victims and abortion procedures. We'll have our students go and do really difficult things, and they lose friends and reputation points. We do it because we think that that's the call that's the appropriate response to the injustice that's taking place. One step, is just to get involved, is just to be pro-life, is just to do the minimal amount of work. But at some point, we need to stop gathering together with people that already agree with us, and we need to go out and talk to people that really hate us. And it's going to be difficult, and it really sucks, and it's not fun, and it never gets to be fun. And it gets to be easier, I guess, over time, but it's never going to be easy to do because it's just an emotional, controversial topic to be talking about. 2, it's also emotionally exhausting because you get to a point where you're like, why am I still having to talk to people about killing people? Like, why do I still have to try to convince people in the street to not kill other people? Like, it seems like it's so obvious, and it can be exhausting to keep doing that day in and day out. But I promise you that it is worth it. There are people alive today because of the students that we work with. There are when I go out and I talk to people on the street, I'm more comfortable with my own self because I know that the world's a little less pro-abortion than it was when I woke up. We have a little bit more of a culture of life. There's a few more people that think abortion is an injustice. We're moving inch by inch closer to our goal. And if I'm not doing this, I'm not comfortable with who I am. I'm not comfortable with myself because I'm letting injustice persist, because I'm shouting out the window and closing the window so I don't have to hear the screams anymore. Now, I know, I'll take, I have some questions and stuff like that, and I'll stick around for a little while if you have time to, if you have other questions. But I do want to caution you. Some of you in this room might be very, head thinkers and stuff. That's kind of my natural disposition, is I think about this issue as just like a human rights issue, and it's like, sometimes it seems like really black and white. And I'm like, yeah, they're human, they're equal. So because I believe in human equality, I'm against abortion, and I can't understand why you might be against that, why you would oppose that. And sometimes I just like talking about the philosophy of it, and why are humans valuable, and why are humans equal, and why do we have rights? Where do those rights come from? Blah, blah, blah. And it's very interesting. And sometimes we get caught up in talking about how interesting some of this stuff is, and we kind of treat the issue very in a kind of like a sterile manner. And I was doing that for a long time, until I was kind of rocked by this story of this other pro-lifer that came and spoke at an event for Protect Life Michigan a few years ago. His name is Jonathan. He lives in Toronto, and he's a full-time pro-life missionary as well. He's out there every single day, all day, doing outreach on the streets of Toronto. And sometimes he goes and he'll talk to churches. He'll do kind of like this type of thing, talk to pro-life people or whatever, and do trainings. And one day he was doing that at a church in Ontario. And afterwards, this older man came up to him and was like, "Jonathan, I need to show you something." And Jonathan's like, "Okay, what do you need to show me, right?" And he's like, "Come with me." And they walk out of the auditorium. And they walk out into the parking lot, and this older man tells Jonathan to get in his car. And if you've ever been a pro-life person doing stuff don't get in other people's cars that you don't know, it's not safe. Just in general, if you're a student, if you're a person, just don't do it. Don't get in other people's cars. But Jonathan gets in this guy's car, and they drive off. And the older man pulls into his driveway of his home. And he brings Jonathan inside his house. Again, don't do it, but whatever. Jonathan's a grown man, I guess. And he ushers Jonathan into the garage. And at this point, Jonathan's actually getting a little bit nervous because he doesn't know this guy, and now he's in this guy's garage. So he's looking around, taking mental notes of everything that's happening, so he can recall it later when he has to report it to the police, right? So he's trying to remember everything, all the details and everything. And this old man's in the corner shuffling through some boxes on a shelf in his garage. And Jonathan's looking around, wondering what's going on. And all of a sudden, Jonathan describes this feeling where he's like, "My feet became like concrete. And all the blood drained from my face. And I couldn't speak, I couldn't think. I was I wasn't even there anymore, because this man was walking towards him. And this man was holding in his hand a jar, and in this jar was a little boy. And he's walking towards him with this little boy in a jar, and he hands it to Jonathan, and Jonathan describes this feeling. And maybe you guys have an experience like this, it's like a sensory memory, where even more than like the sight of something, you remember the way that something like felt or smelled or what it tasted like or something like that. And sometimes those are really positive like experiences. But he describes the sensory memory of this experience where he's like, more than seeing this child in a jar, I remember the way it felt when his feet tapped the bottom of the glass in my hand. I remember the way it felt when his head banged against the side of the glass as he moved around in the jar in my hand. And finally, after a minute, Jonathan couldn't take it anymore, and he put this jar down on a freezer in this guy's garage. And he looks at the top of the jar, and there's a little white sticker on it. And on that sticker has two things. It has a date and has an address. And as he's looking at that, he remembers or he understands what those things mean. The date is the date that child lost his life, and the address is where he lost his life. And as he's processing that, he has this realization. Jonathan's a Christian, and he understands this call that we have to care for widows and to care for orphans. And as he's looking at this jar, he realizes that there is no one more orphaned in this world than that little boy in a jar, in a box, in someone's garage in Toronto, Ontario. Because we don't know anything about him. We don't know who his family was. We don't know his name. We don't know what he would have hoped or dreamed to accomplish in his life. We don't know what circumstances led to his mother making that decision. All we know of this little boy is the day they died in the clinic that he was killed in. And that story is one of those things that is like a life-altering thing to think about, for me at least. It makes this incredibly human. It makes this an incredibly less of a hobby for me and more of a burden for me. And I can't stop. There are very few days where I don't wrestle with stories like that and question what I'm doing and if I'm doing enough. And it has caused me to do more and sacrifice more and get more uncomfortable and do more difficult things. And I hope that realizations like that can settle in on you as well. Because whether or not someone dies, whether or not there are more or less people alive tomorrow, in some ways rests on the actions that we do or do not take right now. So now I realize abortion is really difficult to talk about, so if I have a few minutes, if there are any questions or anything like that you guys have about our outreach or particular challenges or anything?
5 minutes of questions with the teens. The teens are going to break up into small groups, and then I know there are some who are not in high school who can stay, and Trevor, please be with us.
Yeah.
And we'll have adoration as well if you'd like, if you're able to stay, and then food and hang out as well. So,
sweet.
But we're going to take 5 minutes with the teens, ask Trevor some questions, and yep, and then.
Okay. Yeah, in the back.
A lot of pro-choice people use this argument where we should abort this child because we don't know if their life is going to be like good or not. So like, what do you say to those people?
Yeah, they'll say, do you know anything about the foster care system? Or they're going to go up in terrible poverty or whatever. So it's almost like as an act of mercy, we can prevent someone from going through that difficult life via abortion. And again, that line of argument flies in the face of any idea of human equality, because essentially now what the argument that's being made is someone's worth, someone's equality, someone's value, someone's rights is going to be determined based on the quality of life that we perceive that they're living. And we're going to say, as someone who is privileged and is in this situation, I think that if you're in foster care, or if you're poor, or if you go hungry sometimes, or if you're suffering as a victim of abuse, it'd be better if you were dead. So I'm going to decide for you that abortion is the best solution for you as a victim of injustice. And there's no other situation where we would ever justify killing to solve injustice. We don't think that taking the life of of a victim should ever be the solution to that victim's suffering. It's so anti-common sense, but we allow that to be an argument, and it dehumanizes not only the unborn child who might end up in a situation of suffering, it dehumanizes the real people right now, or the people right now who are really experiencing that suffering, because it says, if we could rewind, it'd be better if you were never here. It'd be better if I decided that your life should be ended. So we can't let someone's quality of life dictate their rights as an equal human being. Yeah.
So like one thing that I hear a lot was like, what if the mother's life is at risk? So what's your view on that?
Yeah. So what if the mother's life is at risk? So real quick, it's a common one. It's pretty easy to answer because our position is that the unborn child is equal, not greater than the mother. So the mother has a right to not die, to not be killed, just like the unborn child has a right to not die or not be killed. So if the mother's life is going to be lost, she has every right to pursue whatever medical treatment she needs to preserve her own existence, her own life. Sometimes that will result as a consequence, as an unintended consequence ultimately, in the death of another person, which is a tragedy, is a life being lost. But it's in this situation where she needs to preserve her own life. It's very, very rare, but we would never say a woman cannot get cancer treatment if she's pregnant. We would never say that a woman cannot get, if she has an ectopic pregnancy, cannot get surgery to remove that embryo that will kill her, even though that will result in the death of that child. It's a tragedy that happens, but we need to be in a situation where we're defending all life, not focusing just on one over the other. Yeah.
What do you do when you're like stuck and you don't know what to say?
Yeah.
To the person when they have like a really good argument?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah. So her question was, what do we do when we're talking about abortion and we're kind of stumped, or we don't know what to say, or it's a really difficult question or circumstance or whatever? One encouraging thing is that there are no new ideas in this debate, like at all. Like the same ideas have been echoed for decades now on both sides, because both sides have their arguments. It's just that ours is better. Their arguments have not changed. Their arguments are going to be either like from a place of ignorance, where they're just like, it's not a human, it's not alive, and it's like really easy to combat that because pro-choice scientists combat that. Or they're going to make an argument about equality based on their poverty or whatever. So once you hear like the first 10 arguments, that's all you need to hear. You can say, I'm not really sure the answer to that. If they have like a very specific like stat or something like that, I'll gladly look into that and get back with you. But one thing I just want to caution you guys on is never let fear of looking dumb or not knowing what to say or saying the wrong thing hold you back from engaging in this issue, because I promise you 100% it will always be the case that whatever you say is going to be 1,000,000 times better than the alternative, which is no one steps in to defend the victim of abortion. No one steps in to claim their equality. No one steps in to try to prevent their loss of life. You stumbling through the worst apologetic ever is so much better than the alternative. I'll take one more.
So what would you say to someone you have a conversation and they're like, I was sexually abused, and like I don't want to be reminded of like a child.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably so what about in the case of a woman is pregnant and it's the result of sexual abuse, rape, incest, something like that, right? That's the one that if you ever have to predict what question is going to be asked of you when you're going out and doing outreach, it's always going to be that one, because it's so prevalent and so important to be able to answer that. The first thing you have to do, this goes back to not being too much of a head thinker all the time, is you have to not skip the fact that abortion or no abortion, pregnancy or no pregnancy, a tragedy and an injustice has already taken place for that woman. And whether or not she gets an abortion, she's gonna be living with the consequences of that for the rest of her life. And we fail over and over again, more than we succeed at handling those situations at all levels of society, from an individual level, from a family level, from a church level, from a government level. In general, we are all failing at responding to this issue. And you need to acknowledge that, and you need to recognize when someone might be asking for help versus asking for an argument. But if someone's like genuinely inquisitive and like, hey, what about this exception for this particular situation? It comes back again to a human equality and a human rights point of view, and our position is going to be consistent. That the manner in which you were conceived does not impact the value that you have as a human being. I support every possible support system for a woman in that situation and in other situations that are crisis pregnancies. Everything we should, government, charity, churches, families, individuals, we all have a responsibility to do something. The only thing I don't think is an acceptable solution to an injustice like sexual abuse and rape is killing of innocent people. I don't think that's the appropriate thing. Real quick, it was like 30 seconds, sorry. The example that you can sometimes use is, it's called trotting out a toddler, where, what's that? It's called trot out a toddler. So trot out a toddler, meaning whenever you're confronted with an argument for abortion, you trot out a toddler, figurative toddler, don't actually bring in a toddler, but you trot out like an imaginary toddler, and you ask yourself, does that argument justify killing this 2 or 3-year-old right now? If it doesn't, then you have a way to show that it denies, essentially the argument denies human equality. So you say, imagine that a woman is raped and she gets pregnant. She decides that she's going to go through with this pregnancy. And she gives birth to this little boy. And for a couple of years, it's going as well as possible, given the situation. She's getting some healing, some counseling. The guy's locked up. She loves this little boy, and he's bringing some joy back to her. Whatever, it's going okay. But about 3 years in, something changes, because around that time, he begins to kind of lose his baby face a little bit, and he starts growing into the young adult that he's going to look like. And one day she walks downstairs and she looks at this little boy that she loves so much, and she no longer can see him. All she ever sees is his biological father. And every time she looks in his face, she relives the trauma of that day over and over and over and over. And it causes her to spiral and to go into tremendous depression. She can't love or support this child anymore. She is overcome with trauma and suffering. In that situation, we want to help in whatever way possible. The only thing that we would not be okay or comfortable doing would be saying it'd be okay to take the life of a 3-year-old to relieve the suffering, the very real suffering that she's going through. Why would it not be okay to take the life of a 3-year-old, but take the life of the unborn, same child, a few years earlier? Because the only difference between those two humans is one's smaller and one's less developed and one's more dependent. Those differences aren't morally significant. The manner in which you're conceived does not impact your human value, your human rights, and that's why we would be consistent in our approach on this issue. So again, I thank you. I ran way over, so I apologize, but I'll be staying back for a little while as well.